Hey fellow fraud fighters, I'm Jimmy Fong, CCO at Seon, and welcome to the Cat and Mouse podcast. Seon is fortunate to work with businesses such as the likes of Revolut, Nubank and Patreon in the fight against fraud. But with this podcast, we want to provide a comfortable space for people to talk about the daily challenges, topics on the horizon, and ultimately give us all a better insight into the mindset of fraudsters. And with that, on with the show.
Hi, thanks for letting me say a few words on what's been a career here, Jimmy, in terms of preventing fraud. I'm John Marsden. I started my career in payments in Barclays, looking after merchant acquirers. Certainly an interesting introduction to fraud when you sort of wake up and realise one of your merchants has done a runner with several £1 million. That was a rude introduction to it. I think I've always been attracted to the subject. My father was chief super in the police. It is a sexy subject. I mean, if you can say at a party when you're a youngster, you fight fraud, it's probably, goes down quite well. The question, one of the questions that come up in this career is, what have we done over the years to prevent fraud, and how do those fraudsters then organically generate beyond that? And, in the UK, and I'll look at the UK in particular and then expand it out to a few other countries, we have this concept of an identity, but there's no official registry of an identity. So over the years, we've proved identity by a name, an address, a date of birth. And actually, if you think about it, Jimmy, the only unique thing in your identity from a UK perspective is actually your date of birth, because everything else can change, including national insurance numbers, passport changes every time you issue it, driving license number should stay consistent, but there is issue numbers there. And none of those documents actually form an identity document. So a passport is a travel document, a driving license, a license to drive. That's contrary to what we see in other states. So that initially led us to, we needed to facilitate digital interactions, and to be able to prove someone's ID at that level, it was really the credit reference agencies that came up with the best solutions to be able to prove that identity exists and confirm the date of birth. That was great for a while, and you can bolster that up with negative and fraud databases and fraud observations to build some trust in there. But very quickly, the fraudsters realised how they could compromise that. That led on, and then we saw data theft as a massive issue, ID takeover as a massive issue. Why? We were all relying on those simple bits of data to confirm an identity. They were so easily compromised and became the breeding ground for the criminals. That's why they were doing these hacks. That's why they were buying this data off the dark markets. That's how they were doing it. So over the years, and the one beautiful thing of that, it was silent as well. There was no friction involved in that interaction. It's a digital interaction. I take those details off you that you expect to give me, and I confirm them with a third party in under a second. What a fantastic experience. And if you remember, the UK, well ahead of everyone with those digital economies, and that enabled us as a country to embrace digital. In fact, some of our legislation about, supporting people putting a tick box to confirm that they accept a contract really supported that as well. So the government, the legislature and everything facilitated digital commerce, but the fraudsters took advantage of that. We've had many discussions about a scheme in the UK over the years. We've had ID schemes that were thrown out before a general election, some 18 years ago, I believe, and then obviously manifested into the verified scheme for digital ID for government, which was, a mixed blessing for some people. Some people enjoyed the experience being able to authenticate straight away. Others felt that they were better with government ID, and there was a little bit of contention about who was doing what. And certainly within the industry, there was a lot of discussion about, why was the majority of the verifications going to one party. So it's no surprise that the partners pulled out. It's no surprise that the government have decided to move on from that. And they have introduced something around the digital identity scheme, which is very similar to that, but more probably more commercially focused. Let's park that to one side, come back to this. What do we do next after we've got this purely compromised data? So data can be compromised. that fed into KBA. So, me as part of Equifax, we were the primary vendor of knowledge-based authentication based on credit file in the UK for a number of years. That was great. And if you ever get a consumer to go through that process and then say, I don't know how a fraudster would have got past those questions. The issue is it's knowledge, and knowledge is transferable. If I can compromise that knowledge, I can therefore compromise your knowledge-based authentication and authenticate myself. I'm not going to talk about the techniques to get to those answers, but once you know, it's too bloody easy. So we had to do something else, didn't we? We had to move away from this paradigm. And, me as a credit reference guy saw the point of friction in someone picking a document that was a travel document or a license to drive out of a wallet and showing that digitally. It's an answer. So people like, I'll name some of the guys in this on Fido, Jumio, OCR Labs, all these people were offering friction into a process and actually a lot of error as well. This is an interesting paradigm because catching from analog to digital is an issue. Getting someone to take a good photo that can then give you the intelligence you need and the veracity you need still has that element of, difficulty in terms of taking the analog to the digital, but also a trust question. So if I can get into the chip, I have to read the image to get into a chip on an e-card. Well, it might give me a little bit more trust. If I can do a selfie and a liveness selfie, it gives me a bit more trust that person is who it says it is. And I can understand why it's grown, but it's also not a panacea. It's not foolproof. They do have false positives. They do have false negative rates. There is still that need for what we did in data ID terms of bolstering it with fraud controls to spot what's anomalous.
Just to add, John, the thing we see again and again from customers that we're helping is actually the marketing churn of that as well. Meaning, for all the half of the people that you ask for that selfie to take out, your license from your wallet, half just don't bother doing it as well. So there's an element of that. You're just losing that top of the funnel churn, which is crazy for the business or financial service as well, right?
Absolutely. So if I work back a few years, there was a survey done. It was actually out of one of the banks, and they considered that at one of their lines, the person applying, if they'd entered the application process, was already worth. They'd already spent £50 to get them there in above line marketing, etc. To get them to bail out of a frictionful process is a nightmare, and we see that all over the place, Jimmy. I mean, if you look at the introduction of 3DS, what's that, 12 years ago, something like that. At the start of that, there was 20% dropout at checkout, and for a retailer, that's all their profit gone. Certainly, frictionful application processes make people drop out. I'll be fair, and I don't find this in some consumer interviews, so I'm maybe not normal, but I will share this with you. I will drop out of an application process if they ask me for a document because my wallet is on the other side of the house, and I really forget about it by the time I've checked my emails or moved on to something else. So, I might reconnect with that business later, and I might go through the process. I might not. Who knows? So we do lose people that way. Some of the consumer work I've done recently is particularly interesting. So obviously, when they don't see friction, the consumer, they don't know what's going on, and you don't really want to disclose to the world what fraud prevention measures you've got anyway. It's interesting if you see how people deal with someone like PayPal, who you can actually visibly see there's a check going on, and I don't believe that's not thought about. So as a consumer, I can see some security is happening. So to move that forward into ID&V. Out of a series of interviews recently with consumers I was doing for an ID&V provider, we saw that certain individuals felt that the provision of ID established trust with that community, whether that be a bank, so they trusted other bank accounts that had gone through that process, or Airbnb, an ID verified identity is felt to be more valuable. So you're starting to see that equation in the mind saying, well, I'm going through this, everyone else is going through this, so therefore there's a level of trust in my mind to this organization and the network it supports. I think that's important. Not many people in those surveys actually saw like I did, that it was a hassle getting up from a desk and go and get my document. And I, what can I say? That's just me, and I've admitted to that. But it certainly wasn't common. You also had a huge. I think everyone had a second moment of thought before they entered they passed over their identity details. All of them had a moment of doubt. Okay. And this is often where the breakdown comes. So I'm having a moment of doubt. If I know your brand and I trust your brand, I'm more than likely to go ahead with the process and put it to one side. And that was evident in the interviews. If I don't know your brand, and I have any feeling that that you may not be trustworthy, they will bail out. Now, one of those respondents was redirected to a third-party application that was branded as that provider's brand. They bailed out of that process straight away. They had no understanding of who that brand was, the trust in that brand, and they certainly were not prepared to put their own identity documents into something that they really didn't feel was safe. So that's great. So we can recognize the consumer has this dialogue about trust going on in their mind. We just need to be mindful of that. I don't think that the issue of friction is the primary issue. And as I say, maybe people are like me and they come back. But the issue of trust is probably the thing that's breaking down mostly in these relationships. After all, you want a product. Most people have gone through ID&V recently with getting NHS passports, of course. Totally different process for totally different people, and depends where you are in the UK. But most people were accepting of the process, even though it wasn't real time. That found an interest to me, because we as providers, we're all striving, and this conversation, friction-free, fast delivery, get it into their hands. Depends what you're doing. It's got to be right in context. So people waiting for the NHS app to say, yeah, you're okay for an hour and a half, they are absolutely fine with that. They're prepared before they go to events. They were prepared way in advance, and they do it. I'm sure I'm going to find the exceptions to the rule. He was trying to get in a rugby stadium 2 hours before, trying to get his COVID pass. Now, I'm sure there's that, but that's kind of not a reflection on the technology.
That's back to, John, what you said about brand, right? It was a necessity as well. It gave you, allowed you access. It affected your lifestyle, but then the brand, right? People can make that easy decision in their head that, oh, this is the government NHS. Thus, it's it kind of helps accelerate these kind of acceptance and normalization of this as well.
Totally agree with that. Yeah. I think it's also, you make the risk decision, don't you? So if I asked you for a passport to buy something for 25 quid off someone or other, you'd go sod off. So your context comes into it. And that includes we'll come back to PayPal payments, one-click payments. Just skewed, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. One click, done. Gives all the delivery address and everything. I love it. You've got to make that risk decision. Would I take one click when I was trying to, open a bank account? I used to. It used to be that easy. And it still is in many occasions. But there is this element of, what trust does that consumer see in your organization? I mean, what are other countries doing? Well, EIDAS is coming to the European region, and Verify was our nod to EIDAS off the UK base. A government-backed digital identity. It's interesting because we have seen the Scandinavia one, the bank ID, which was provided by the banks, but accepted widely by everyone in Scandinavia. That really helped them go digital, although there's relatively smaller small numbers of people in those regions, it has been successful. It's also been compromised. I'll come on to that compromise in a second. And we are pushing out with digital ID across the rest of Europe, and some are more advanced than others. And of course, Europeans, ironically, not so adverse to, I'll bring this back into the UK stuff in a minute, not so adverse to having ID cards. Which is strange, considering where they come from. The privacy and the GDPR rules are massive over there. Why? Because, governments had used data to segregate societies and victimize people over the years. If you're a German or an Austrian, you understand what, the regime of Adolf Hitler did in that term of dividing and grading people and segregating people. Equally, same's happened in across Europe, in Spain, etc. So they tend to be a little bit more private with their data. However, all of them have accepted that a national ID card is the way to go, a national ID scheme, which is then becoming the electronic version of that. That's interesting. Our government is being a little bit more commercial about it, and they've introduced this digital identity attributes framework, which looks similar to what we've had before. I think the issue for them is consumer perception. So if you look at the statistics, significant amount of feedback received from members of the public. In the main, the feedback told us that individuals have concerns about digital identity products, particularly around the use of their data. So there's a large percentage of individuals who are against the idea of an ID scheme. It's a real problem for the government to manage to take this into the next stage of development due to the public's lack of sanction. It's kind of weird from my point of view when we're using passports and driving licenses to prove identity. And no one seems to have an issue with that. But when you talk about an ID scheme, which is really making those documents fit for purpose, we seem to have an issue with it as a society. So we'll see where that goes. Tot off the press. I think the government issued the policy paper in September of this year. So please take a look at it.
I want to, John, revisit some of those items you mentioned around particularly Scandinavia, some of those bank ID schemes, because there is, I think, the strong kind of understanding that those have been a bit of a silver bullet in terms of helping to give trust and act as a secure framework to operate off. But it sounds like there is no kind of silver bullet, I think is kind of your view, John.
This is really easy demonstrated here. So in the UK, we pretty much did a very good job of using the types of technology that CN has or Threatmetrics or one of these providers to be able to discern a good consumer from a bad consumer. We put all the ID on. It was doing a pretty good job. Actually, the fraudsters still got around that. Why? They just started, the spate of APP is absolutely compromising everything. It's looking from a criminal point of view and going, where's the point of weakness? Now, we as vendors, and this brings us on to what I do today, we as vendors see this from a siloed point of view. We think in different terms. We think about compliance, we think about ID, we think about fraud, and we try and blend this into some professionalism. We've got to remember, our criminals don't think like that. They just look at opportunity. How can I break this? So as you're trying to concentrate on one thing, they've realized that, hold on, the weakness is on the other side. When it comes to APP, the weakness was the consumer. I now can't compromise your SMS. I can't get the out of band to take over your bank accounts and transfer your money. But you can do that for me, can't you, Mr. Consumer? I tell you what, I'll scare the living daylights out of you, and you'll press those buttons and you'll say, pay him £20,000. Thank you very much. So even with something like Bank ID, you've got a person, and the person becomes your point of compromise. Okay. So if you look at something like, really admire this, Barclays, £10 million above the line advertising to help consumers stop fraud. And why? Because their biggest threat right now, it's not the technology, it's not the application, it's not account takeover. This is really locked down. It's you as a consumer. You are the weakest link. So how do Barclays make you the strongest link? I think it's so admirable. Why? Because you're advertising to the UK. They're not all your customers, Barclays, but thank you ever so much for trying to keep us safe, because someone has to. So yeah, even with the government ID schemes, a level of assurance is going to be, high for someone who's a genuine customer. So you tell me where your weakest link is. Who do I compromise? Who do I scare? It's not hard for a confidence fraudster to drum up a story that motivates someone into action.
So that's a really good segue into, okay, so the consumer is the weak point here, and that's kind of the nature of fraud, or kind of any kind of abuse. Is kind of human creativity on working out what's the weakest link in that chain. What about other bigger schemes we've seen around the world, like the Indian Aadhaar scheme, for instance? Is it all subject to, if the tech's been locked down, process has all been, kind of strong enough on one side, fraud moves to a different bit? What's your kind of view on that, John, then? Because these are obviously massive schemes.
I'm sure it's a very high-tech scheme. It's not the only time to do it. Your signature is your fingerprint in, I think it's Chile, it's on your ID card. I think the technology will help you identify where the first party has done the actions. Of course, biometrics are pretty damn good, and I'm sure that the Indians have put, great technology in. Still comes back to, how do I compromise you if I can't do that? And I just compromise you as an individual. I send you and let's look at what we're doing at the moment. Everyone's being warned about WhatsApp messages from your family saying, I've had this. Can you help me out? This. What am I doing now? I'm not approaching the company direct, because you've got great security. What I'll do is I'll compromise what I can, which is the individual. I think that you have to. Well, the next question comes: how do you control your human behavior to stop that? The biggest risk we face from fraud today in the economy is actually, it's happening everywhere, but it's actually a company. Where you are today, the biggest issues are phishing generated ransomware. We've had James Hall and Co. this week that's been down for a couple of days because of ransomware. We had NHS departments go down from ransomware. And we never know how many of these ransoms are actually being paid. We don't know how successful they are. It's a big brand reputation thing for you to have been hacked. And I'll tell you something else. People can get in through your systems. There can be penetration. However, that's getting harder and harder. It's the same paradigm. We've locked down those areas for entry. I guess Target didn't with the air conditioning system, but we learned from that. So we've got really good IT security, but it doesn't take a lot to be able to compromise the individuals.
That makes a lot of sense. To pick up your thread around, the individual being the weak point now. We had it ourselves. We're a startup. Literally fighting fraud. And then we had a couple of our teammates receive WhatsApp messages supposedly from one of the co-founders and CEO asking them exactly the same message that you mentioned. Hey, we need some help. We're in a difficult situation. Can you just wire over something to get us out of it? Like crazy, right? So it's very much targeting the individual now and trying to play off, if you like, a bit of social engineering. So you're absolutely right on that.
And this is an interesting one with social engineering. Do we really understand social engineering? One of the big things that intrigued me was when I was with the larger corporates. I'd go through these training courses on social engineering, and they tell me these big, long, convoluted and true stories about how people have been befriended. I have the pleasure now, or the displeasure, whichever way you want to look at it, of working with some fraudsters, some ex-fraudsters that now look at preventing crime. I didn't really realize how easy it was to socially manipulate someone. I didn't realize the level of data they need is nowhere near what I might consider to be a compromise. Even you, Jimmy, if I phoned you up and said, hey, is Liam in the office today? And you said, well, no, Liam's at his sister's birthday party today. Okay, thanks. I have probably got enough to get into your office. Doing some work, I turn up at the door. I've left my idea. We're doing some work for Liam, but I know he's away at his sister's birthday party today. Can I just go and get my ID badge? Yeah, sure. Come on in. So every little bit you say can be used as social engineering, and I don't think we understand the risks. One of the things we do with We Fight Fraud is we look at the cyber risks, but we also look at social engineering risks and the physical risks. So if we can't get into a system, we'll get into a building and drop a device onto their system just to prove we can do it. We've had listening devices in the boardroom of trading companies before now and all that. And the reason for that is to say a criminal looks at all these methods, and we should, as much as we need to and maintain the security of the digital channels, keep the fraud prevention up, keep the because that won't go away. We'll still get even brute force attacks and sophisticated attacks on our online channels. Of course we will, but equally we've got to expand that a little bit to look at people risk, because that's where everyone seems to be finding the weaknesses now.
You mentioned with the organization, I think it was started by Tony Sales, right? And his background is very much, black hat turned, white hat, if you like. What's that meant to you, kind of, to get an insight and to work in, day out with that kind of mentality, as you go now?
It's different. That's a really interesting question, Jimmy, because you brought up with these disciplines and to think about things in a slightly different way, and a language that we talk in the fraud prevention community. They don't talk about account takeover. They don't talk about application fraud. They don't have the labels that we have. So it's kind of interesting interpreting the language. What strikes me most is the blatant the blatant disregard for everything we've tried to do. So they don't really care how we're trying to stop them. They only care. They only care when something changes. So, for example, if they've got a nice scheme going, a nice application scheme, and you stop it, they might spend a cursory moment or get hold of the techie guys and say, "Do you know what's going on here? How can we fool it?" And they might try a few times, but in essence, they don't really care because they just move on to the next provider. So it is true what we've always said in fraud prevention, don't be the weakest link, because they don't care where the money comes from. They're not brand loyal, for God's sake. They don't really care. And they also don't care that it's some magical hack. They're not like us, getting really excited about machine learning algorithms and things like that. Just make it work. And if that's people compromise, we'll compromise the people. If it's listening device, if it's system access, we'll do what needs to be done to get that done. Ironically, today, what have we got? We've got people who specialize in bit parts of each crime. We always have. So, criminal networks were informal networks of almost people with a talent in one way or another to add to the gang. That's still going on. It's going on in a digital way. People in Romania are hiring people in the UK to do bits that are physically done over here, and we're hiring them to do technical bits. There's no. It's a big economy. There's a million ways that they can be creative, and I think that's probably one of the biggest learns is the creativity. And that comes back to us thinking about silos, us thinking about structures, us doing our learning, has put us in a position of not being able to see things from a utterly creative point of view. What can I do holistically to compromise this? So that's one of the biggest learns of dealing with Tony. We also have Solomon Gilbert, who's an extremely good hacker. That's interesting too. He also thinks very differently, extremely paranoid technically. because he knows what he could do. So, yeah. And then the counter side to that, we've got Andy MacDonald, ex-head of terrorist financing from the Scottish office, Scotland Yard. That's incredible, to see those play. It's not a marriage made in heaven. One's a copper, one's an ex-fraudster, but we get magic going. The sparks between that in that relationship that really helps us do that. And then Dr. Nicola Harding of Lancaster University, who keeps it all based in some academic science. So working with the team with these really diverse backgrounds has been really useful and insightful. They have something special, which is an ability to reach into the criminal mind that I've not seen. I've seen that from a Canadian company who does similar, but in terms of UK, I don't think there's anything more advanced than our thinking there.
I think hearing that it's coming from all these different perspectives is the key, right? And that allows, quite frankly, a new way to look at threats, opportunities, because that's exactly what it is, right? It works on both ends like that.
Yeah, absolutely it does. I think the brilliant headline we're going to have for the community this year is we're going to get Andy MacDonald, so the ex-head of SO15, to interview Emilio De Giovanni, the ex-head of a mafia family.
Yeah, crazy. Fascinating.
So this is going to be great. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that later on this year. It should be later on, early next year. It should be really, really intense. I think we need to see things. I don't want to glamorize the criminals, but I think we as a prevention community need to see things. We need to hear things from the criminals' point of view to be able to understand that holistic view of how they view an attack, what constitutes and what sort of tools they will use against us.
And John, this has been a fascinating chat. It's been amazing to hear from your deep experience, your view of ID and ID fraud and how that's evolved over time, from all the way in your banking days through to some of the seminal credit bureau agencies, through to tech, and where you land today with We Fight Fraud. Been super interesting. For the audience, where can folk, can you point them to a certain direction if they want to find out more about yourself, John, about We Fight Fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. Myself, I can find me on LinkedIn the usual way. But so We Fight Fraud, www.wefightfraud.org, and that will take you through our services. And certainly, I'm willing to talk about anyone who wants to stop crime. Yeah, that's really important to me.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Jim.
Brilliant, John. Awesome to have you on, and look forward to hearing it. I love the element of that ex-head of the Italian mafia going live next year. Thanks again, John.
Thanks. Cheers, Jimmy.